It was one of those early mornings where the air still carried that raw chill before the sun really wakes up the city. The construction site sat like a half-finished promise, steel ribs poking at the sky, mud thick underfoot, the sound of machinery coughing awake. Marcus Williams walked in quiet but confident, a roll of blueprints tucked under one arm and his coffee in the other. He was 32, tall, sharp around the edges, not the kind of man who needed to announce himself. His clothes were clean, pressed, but not flashy. Work boots still new enough to say he wasn't the one pouring the concrete. But that didn't stop the stares. Every head turned when he stepped past the chain-link gate. A dozen white guys in orange vests froze mid-hammer or mid-laugh, sizing him up like a stranger who walked into their living room uninvited. Rick Dalton, the foreman, stood by the foundation pit. Thick build, sun-creased skin, the type of guy who'd worked his whole damn life under the open sky. He didn't even ask Marcus's name before barking, "Hey, we start the pour at 9. Don't just stand there, grab a helmet and check the mixer." Marcus blinked once. He'd been mistaken before, it wasn't new. But something about the tone scraped him raw anyway. Still, he kept his face calm, voice even. "Actually," he said, "I'm Marcus Williams, lead architect on this project." That stopped the noise cold. The foreman's smirk faltered for half a second. Around them, a wrench clanked to the ground. A couple of workers coughed, pretending to be busy. Rick tried to recover with a half-hearted chuckle, though his eyes narrowed a little. "Well, hell," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't think the city'd send another expert down here to tell us how to build." Marcus didn't bite. He just nodded politely and said, "Glad to be working with you, Rick. Let's make sure we're aligned on the schedule." Rick gave a tight grin, but the resentment in his jaw said more than words. He'd been running sites like this for 20 years. Now, some polished city boy was about to oversee him. Marcus could feel the air shift, that invisible wall that comes up when you walk into a place where people already decided who you are. He kept walking, head held high, stepping through puddles and scattered rebar like he'd been doing this all his life. Inside, though, a tiny spark burned. The familiar kind, the one that whispered, "Not again." By the time he reached the temporary office trailer, the workers had already gone back to their noise. Laughter a little louder now, hammers hitting a little harder than needed. Rick watched him from a distance, chewing on his words like old tobacco. Marcus unrolled his blueprints across the desk, tracing lines with his pencil. Steady hands, sharp eyes. But there was a tremor there, not fear, just restraint. The kind that comes from knowing if you push back too hard, you'll become the problem. Outside, the gray sky hung low, clouds smeared like dust over steel. Everything looked half-finished. The building, the sky, even the people trying to hold it all up. And standing in the middle of it all was Marcus, a man who'd built his career learning how to keep his cool, while the world around him kept testing it. The workday had burned slow. By late afternoon, the sun had turned everything to a blinding sheet of gold, the kind that made metal glare and sweat sting the eyes. The crew packed up, mud-caked boots thudding across plywood paths. The growl of engines and the slam of tailgates echoed off unfinished walls. Rick Dalton sat in his truck, engine idling, radio off. The cab smelled of motor oil and old coffee. He had a stack of papers tossed on the passenger seat, delivery invoices, permits, and one crisp memo that didn't belong in this mess of crumpled junk. It read, "To Rick Dalton, ensure Marcus Williams has oversight approval by Friday." Rick stared at it like it was a bad joke. His jaw clenched so tight a nerve ticked near his temple. "Another city boy," he muttered, voice low. "Another pencil pusher telling me how to do my damn job." He leaned back, thumbed the steering wheel, then sighed. Outside his window, the workers were laughing, some lighting cigarettes, others waving goodbyes. He'd built half this town with men like them, guys who didn't have degrees, who learned things the hard way, through splinters and bruises and long days under a sun that didn't care. His gaze drifted to the old photo clipped to his visor. His father stood in it, young, strong, wearing a flannel shirt and a proud grin, one arm around Rick as a boy. Behind them was a small house they'd built together from scratch. Rick's chest tightened. The old man never went to college, never needed to. He built things that lasted. Schools, churches, barns. His hands told his story. Now Rick sat here in a truck filled with paperwork, taking orders from someone half his age. Someone who'd probably never mixed cement or set a beam with his own two hands. He flipped the photo down and stared at the steering wheel for a long moment. His reflection in the windshield looked older than he remembered. Lines deeper, eyes duller. Maybe it wasn't just pride. Maybe it was fear creeping in. The world was changing fast. Computers, city contracts, new codes, hell, architects half his age running the show. Rick wasn't a bad man, not deep down, but he was scared. Scared of being pushed aside, of being told the way he'd always done things didn't matter anymore. And fear, when it mixes with pride, can make a man mean. He started the truck, let the engine rumble, but instead of heading home, he just sat there, watching the empty sight through his windshield. The steel beams rose against the fading sky, like ribs of something half alive, strong but unfinished. Rick's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He didn't say it out loud, but in his gut, a thought coiled tight. This is still my ground. Then, almost as if to prove it, he crumpled the memo in his hand and tossed it on the passenger seat. The paper landed on the floor, right next to a rusted wrench and an old pair of gloves. Tools from another time, maybe another kind of man. Outside, the sky shifted from orange to gray. The day was done, but something in Rick's chest felt just beginning, a slow fire starting to burn under all that quiet. Night came down like a heavy blanket, quieting the city until only the hum of streetlights and the distant wail of a siren cut through the dark. Inside his apartment, Marcus Williams sat alone at his drafting table, a slim desk lamp spilling warm light across a storm of scattered papers. He'd been at it for hours, sketches layered on sketches, the lines sharp and precise at first, then growing rougher, darker, until the pencil tore through the paper with a jagged rip. He froze, staring at the torn edge like it had betrayed him. The silence around him was thick. Only the low buzz of the lamp filled the room. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His shoulders ached. His mind wouldn't quit replaying the day. Rick's tone, those sidelong glances from the crew, that laughter that never sounded as casual as it looked. He'd told himself for years to stay composed. Be the bigger man. Don't give them the satisfaction. But tonight, that patience felt like a weight tied to his chest. He turned his head toward the corkboard on the wall. There, pinned beneath a thumbtack, was an old letter, edges curled, ink faded from years. He didn't even need to read it anymore. The words were carved into him. We regret to inform you that your application was not selected. While your qualifications are impressive, We are seeking a candidate who better fits our company culture. He had gotten that letter after his third interview with a firm uptown, a place where smiles were sharp and polite, and every handshake felt like a test. He remembered leaving that building with his jaw locked, telling himself it didn't matter. But it did. Every little rejection, every quiet dismissal, every wrong assumption, they all stacked up like bricks, building walls around his calm. Marcus stood up, walking to the kitchen counter, where an empty mug sat beside a small framed photo of his mother, Gloria. Her smile was soft, the kind that made you feel safe no matter what the world threw at you. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up. "Mom!" He answered, leaning against the counter. "Hey, Ma!" Her voice, warm and steady, carried that gentle authority only mothers have. "You sound tired, baby." Marcus exhaled a slow laugh. "Yeah, long day at the site." "Trouble?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He hesitated. "Nothing I can't handle. Just gets old, you know? Always having to prove yourself twice, just to be seen once." There was a pause. Then her voice softened. "You don't have to stay calm for them, Marcus. You hear me? Calm don't mean quiet. Just means you're choosing your moment." He closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. "I just wish it didn't cost so much to keep that peace." "Everything worth building costs something," she said. "You just make sure you're building you while you're at it." Marcus smiled faintly, eyes drifting to the mess of papers on his desk. "Yeah, I hear you." They said their goodnights. When the call ended, the silence felt different. Less heavy, more like space he could fill. He walked back to the table and picked up his pencil again. The torn page lay there like a scar, but he didn't throw it away. He flipped it over and started sketching on the back. Slower this time, deliberate. Outside, the city lights flickered through his blinds, painting faint lines across the walls, like blueprints of something still being designed. Something strong enough to hold the weight. Marcus's eyes burned from exhaustion, but he kept drawing, the pencil moving steady and sure. Control wasn't about silence. It was about knowing when to speak and when to let your work do it for you. And tonight, his work spoke louder than any argument could. The next afternoon rolled in lazy and warm, the kind that makes time stretch thin. The cafe sat on the corner of Main and Fifth. Small place, old wood floors, walls lined with photos of the town through the years. Locals came here for gossip as much as coffee. Marcus was already at the back table, laptop open, blueprints spread across a worn tabletop that still carried old coffee rings. He looked out of place among the regulars. Pressed shirt, measured calm, but he didn't seem to mind. Linda Moore came in a few minutes later, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. She spotted him and smiled. That kind of easy smile said she'd been waiting for a break in her day. "Hey," she said, setting her tote down. "Sorry I'm late. Site meeting ran long. You know how Rick gets when he's got an audience." Marcus gave a polite smirk. "Yeah, he made his feelings pretty clear yesterday." She sat across from him, lowering her voice. "Don't take him too seriously. Rick's old school, doesn't mean anything by it." Marcus raised a brow. "Doesn't mean anything by what, exactly?" Linda froze for half a beat, realizing she'd walked right into it. "I just mean he's rough around the edges. He's not used to change." Marcus leaned back, tapping a pen on the table. "Change has been around a while, Linda. Some folks just like pretending it hasn't." She didn't argue, just nodded, lips pressed tight. The waitress came by, young woman, gum snapping between her teeth. She handed Linda a menu without a word and turned to Marcus with a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What'll you have?" "Coffee, black," Marcus said. She scribbled it down, or at least pretended to, then walked off. 10 minutes later, Linda's latte arrived with a perfect foam heart on top. Marcus's coffee didn't. Linda noticed before he said anything. "She forgot yours?" He shrugged. "Happens sometimes." She looked toward the counter, ready to flag the waitress, but Marcus gently stopped her with a small shake of his head. "It's fine." He said it quietly, but the words hung between them, heavy and tired, like something he'd said too many times before. Linda looked down at her drink, the foam heart dissolving slowly. "You shouldn't have to let that slide." Marcus smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, a couple of the construction guys from the site, Rick among them, were sitting at a table, laughing over sandwiches. He could hear their voices through the glass, low and easy. One of them glanced in his direction, said something that made the others chuckle. "Let it go," Marcus said, almost to himself. "I'm used to it." Linda didn't respond. The words hit her harder than he knew. Linda looked down at her drink, the foam heart dissolving slowly. "You shouldn't have to let that slide." Marcus smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the window. After they finished their meeting, she walked out to her car, but didn't start it right away. She just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She thought about all the times she'd seen little things like that. The waitress skipping over someone, the jokes at the office that made her wince but never speak up. She always told herself it wasn't her fight, that staying polite kept the peace. But sitting there now, the silence didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like guilt. Inside the cafe, Marcus finally got his coffee. It was lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Outside, Linda's breath fogged the windshield. The sun hit the glass just right, blurring her reflection, her face half in shadow, half in light. Somewhere in between right and wrong, just like she'd been all her life. And that's when it hit her. Silence doesn't make you neutral. It just makes you comfortable. The morning after the cafe felt heavy, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones before the day even starts. Clouds hung low over the site, the air thick with dust and diesel. Marcus showed up early, earlier than anyone else, to double-check the design layout before the inspectors came through. He walked the line of concrete forms, boots crunching over gravel, blueprints in hand, mind already 10 steps ahead. He didn't notice the change right away, not until he reached the west side of the foundation. Something looked off. The support rebar had been moved. Not much, just a few inches, but enough to throw the alignment out of spec. To the untrained eye, it looked fine. To Marcus, it screamed wrong. He crouched down, tracing the line with his finger, heart thudding. Someone had adjusted his plan, and not by accident. He heard a voice behind him. "Morning, boss man," Rick called out, walking up with his hard hat tilted back and a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hope you don't mind. Made a little tweak over here. Thought your design was a bit too tight for the weather load." Marcus stood slowly, jaw tight. "You changed the layout?" "Just a minor adjustment," Rick said, shrugging like it was nothing. "You city folks love your numbers, but out here we trust what holds." Marcus's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. "You trust what you built, not what was approved." Rick's grin faltered. "Relax, man. I've been doing this 20 years. It'll hold." Marcus folded the blueprint and slid it under his arm. "We'll see what the inspector thinks." Rick smirked, but his eyes flickered. "Sure, we'll see." By the time the inspector arrived mid-morning, the site buzzed with quiet tension. The man in the safety vest walked the perimeter, clipboard in hand. He didn't like what he saw. The measurements didn't match the plans. Rick stood nearby, arms crossed, while Marcus handed over the original blueprints. The inspector frowned. These specs don't line up. Who authorized the modification? Before Marcus could answer, Rick jumped in. He did. Said the original layout wasn't practical. Heads turned. The crew froze mid-task, waiting. Marcus blinked once, stunned for just a heartbeat, then said evenly, "That's not true." But the inspector was already scribbling notes. "We'll have to halt this section. Can't proceed until the city reviews the deviation." Rick didn't meet Marcus's eye as he muttered something about paper pushers slowing progress. The crew started whispering. Someone chuckled under their breath. It wasn't funny, but the sound hit Marcus like a slap. He felt the heat rise in his chest. The anger, the frustration, the same damn feeling he'd buried 1,000 times before. He opened his mouth, then stopped himself. Instead, he just nodded stiffly and walked off, hands clenched at his sides. That night, the rain came hard. It drummed on rooftops, flooded gutters, turned the city into a mirror of wet streets and broken light. Marcus drove back to the site. He didn't even know why. Maybe he wanted proof that he hadn't imagined it, or maybe he just needed to see what was left standing after the day's wreckage. He stepped out of his car and stood in the downpour, staring at the half-built structure. The frame rose tall and hollow against the storm, steel bones glistening under flashes of lightning. He walked into the open hall, the wind cutting through him, his clothes soaked through. The rain hit the unfinished roof, dripping in uneven streaks, pooling on the concrete floor. He looked up at the beams, jaw trembling with a mix of rage and exhaustion. "You can build a house from concrete," he said softly, almost like a prayer, "but it still crumbles without respect." The words hung there, carried off by the rain. He stayed there for a long time, just a lone figure in the storm, until the sound of thunder drowned out everything else. By the time he left, the blueprints were wet through, the ink bleeding like veins across the page. But his mind, clearer than it had been in weeks. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The week crawled by slow after the storm. The site stood half silent, half busy. That kind of forced calm that sits heavy before something breaks open. The city had called for a review meeting. Everyone knew it. Nobody said much. By the time Marcus walked into the community center that Friday morning, he'd already made peace with whatever was coming. He wore a clean suit, not too fancy, but sharp, the kind that said professional without needing to prove it. In his hand, a small drive with every file, every timestamp, every plan he'd drawn. Linda was already there, standing near the back of the hall. She caught his eye and gave a tight nod, nervous but determined. Rick stood up front next to a display board with the latest site photos. His sleeves rolled up, arms crossed, face unreadable. He looked like a man trying to stand taller than his guilt. The mayor and a few city investors sat at a long table, papers spread out, voices low and clipped. The air felt like court more than construction. "All right," the mayor said, tapping his pen. "We've got questions about the discrepancies at the East Ridge project. Mr. Dalton, why don't you start?" Rick cleared his throat, glancing once toward Marcus. "Sure. We had a small adjustment on the west frame. Weather shift was throwing off the poor ratio. I made the call. The design looked good on paper, but it needed real-world correction." One of the investors nodded slowly, half listening. Rick leaned into the silence, gaining confidence. The redesign actually improved the stability, saved materials. You can check the stress readings. Marcus said nothing at first. He just watched, calm as still water. But inside, that patience his mother spoke of wasn't silence anymore. It was precision. Linda shifted beside him. She looked at Rick, then at the officials, then at Marcus. You could almost see the war behind her eyes. Stay quiet or stand up. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but clear. That's not true. Every head turned. Rick froze. Excuse me? Linda took a breath. Marcus never approved those changes. I've seen every design, every email. He stayed late, double-checking specs, making sure they matched city standards. The work you saw out there, that's his design. A wave of murmurs passed through the room. Rick started to say something, but Marcus stepped forward. His movements were slow, deliberate. He set his drive on the table, plugging it into the projector. The screen behind him flickered to life, showing blueprint overlays. His initials in the corner, timestamps visible, every line aligned perfectly. These, he said quietly, are the original plans submitted to the city, signed, sealed, dated 3 weeks before construction began. He clicked through the revisions, every change logged, every note documented. His voice didn't shake, not even once. No adjustment was requested or authorized. The deviation was made after inspection scheduling, without approval. The room went still. You could hear the faint hum of the projector, the shifting of papers, the weight of truth settling in. Rick's face drained of color. He looked at the floor, jaw tightening, like he was holding something back. Anger, shame, maybe both. The mayor leaned back in his chair. Seems clear to me, he said slowly. Mr. Williams, your documentation is thorough. We'll restore your oversight immediately. Marcus nodded, simple and professional. Thank you. The meeting ended quick after that. Polite words, handshakes that felt heavier than they looked. As the officials filed out, Linda turned to Marcus. I should have said something sooner. He gave her a small, tired smile. You said it when it counted. Rick stood off to the side, hands shoved in his pockets, staring at the blueprints still glowing on the wall. His pride looked smaller now, like something he'd finally seen for what it really was. He didn't apologize, not out loud. But when Marcus passed him on his way out, Rick's eyes lifted for just a second. The look said everything words couldn't. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just gave a single nod. Quiet, final, like two men acknowledging the truth between them. Outside, sunlight cut through the clouds for the first time all week. It spilled across the concrete steps, warm and sharp, washing the gray off everything it touched. Marcus paused there a moment, eyes closed, face tilted toward the light. It wasn't victory exactly, more like release. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the ground beneath him steady. A few weeks later, the site didn't look like the same place. Where there had been mud and chaos, there was now structure. Clean lines, smooth concrete, glass catching the light like it finally belonged there. The new community center stood proud, simple, and strong. The kind of building that didn't shout for attention, but earned it. The grand opening was set for a Saturday morning. The town came out early. Families, kids, local press. The mayor cut a ribbon that flapped in the breeze. Photographers clicking like it was history. Maybe it was. Marcus stood off to the side of the podium at first, watching it all. His tie was a little crooked. He'd never cared much for ceremony. But when they called his name, he stepped forward, clearing his throat before speaking. "Morning, everyone." His voice carried steady, calm, but full. "You know, when we started this project, we said this place would belong to everyone. Not just the people who built it, not just the ones who paid for it, but every person who needed a place to come together." He paused, scanning the crowd. Parents holding kids, workers still in dusty boots, neighbors shoulder to shoulder. He smiled, just a little. A building's strength isn't in its walls. It's in the hands that build it and the hearts that walk through its doors. There was quiet for a second, the good kind, the kind that means people are really listening. And then came the applause. Not the polite sort either. Real, full applause that came from the gut. Linda stood near the front, clapping hard, proud smile spreading across her face. For her, it wasn't just about the building. It was about finally using her voice when it mattered. Rick was there too, though he stayed toward the back. No spotlight, no speech. Just standing near the benches, helping a couple of the crew guys line them up for the ceremony. His shirt sleeves were rolled, the old tan lines still sharp. He didn't say much, didn't need to. Marcus caught sight of him while stepping down from the podium. For a second, their eyes met across the crowd. No words, just a nod. Small thing, but honest. Marcus nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. More like understanding. Like two men finally realizing they'd been standing on the same ground the whole time, just never looking at it the same way. Kids ran past, laughing, their sneakers squeaking across the new floors. A little boy, maybe 7, stopped in front of Marcus and pointed up at the ceiling. "Did you build this?" Marcus smiled. "We all did." The boy grinned and ran off again. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of conversation, handshakes, and laughter. The place felt alive, alive in the way only something hard-earned could. Later, when most of the crowd had gone, Marcus stepped outside. The sun was bright, the air fresh. Across the courtyard, Rick was picking up stray bits of ribbing and folding chairs. For a man who once thought control meant dominance, there was something almost peaceful about the way he moved now. Quiet, unhurried. Linda came up beside Marcus, holding a cup of lemonade. "Not bad for a few weeks' work," she said, smiling. "Not bad at all," Marcus replied, eyes still on the building. For a while, they just stood there, watching kids draw chalk on the new sidewalks, old folks resting on benches, life filling the space that once was just plans on paper. It was more than a building now. It was proof that things can be rebuilt. People, too. As the afternoon light warmed the brick and glass, Marcus slipped his hands into his pockets, the faint trace of a smile still there. The pencil he always carried rested in his jacket, a habit he couldn't shake, not for control anymore, but as a reminder of what he could create. Behind him, the laughter carried, soft and full. Ahead of him, sunlight danced across the glass panels, bright, unbroken, and new. And in that moment, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like foundation.